The first-class cabin of Flight 882 was supposed to be a sanctuary of luxury, but it instantly turned into a theater of public humiliation. A wealthy platinum-tier passenger stood blocking the aisle, his face red with rage, as he pointed a manicured finger at the young black woman in a pilot's uniform. "I am not trusting my life to a diversity hire," he bellowed, demanding she be escorted off the aircraft. He thought he was exerting his ultimate authority. He had absolutely no idea that the young woman he was trying to publicly destroy was the sole heir to the airline's empire. The rain was coming down in relentless heavy sheets across the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Outside the sprawling glass windows of Terminal 5, the massive silhouette of a Boeing 777-300ER stood waiting under the glaring floodlights. It was a flagship aircraft for Trans-Global Airways, preparing for an overnight transatlantic jump to London Heathrow. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was a curated world of calm designed specifically to shield the ultra-wealthy and corporate elite from the chaotic reality of modern air travel. Seat 2A was occupied by Preston Carmichael. Preston was a man who moved through the world with the absolute certainty that it belonged to him. As a senior vice president at a massive global real estate conglomerate, he was accustomed to a life entirely devoid of friction. He wore a bespoke navy suit that cost more than most people's cars, and a platinum Patek Philippe watch gleamed on his left wrist as he aggressively swiped through emails on his tablet. Preston was a Trans-Global Chairman's Circle member, an invitation-only status reserved for passengers who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on tickets annually. To him, the airline staff were not aviation professionals. They were his personal servants. "Excuse me," Preston snapped, raising a hand without looking up from his screen. Savannah, the lead flight attendant for the premium cabin, hurried over. She had 14 years of experience flying international routes and possessed the kind of polished, infinite patience required to handle the most demanding egos in the sky. "Yes, Mr. Carmichael. How can I assist you this evening?" Savannah asked, her voice a perfect blend of warmth and deference. "This champagne," Preston said, finally looking up to tap the crystal flute on his console. "I specifically requested the 2012 Dom Perignon. This tastes remarkably like the Moët you serve in business class. Are we cutting corners tonight?" "I apologize, Mr. Carmichael. Let me double-check the bottle in the galley and ensure you have exactly what you requested," Savannah replied smoothly, though a flicker of exhaustion crossed her eyes before she masked it. As Savannah retreated, the heavy curtain at the front of the cabin parted. Stepping through the threshold was Valerie Hughes. Valerie was 26 years old, brilliant and deeply focused. She carried her heavy black leather flight bag over one shoulder, her uniform perfectly pressed. The crisp white shirt, the dark tie, and the epaulets on her shoulders signified her rank. She was a first officer trainee currently completing her final line checks for the heavy aircraft division. Valerie had graduated at the very top of her class at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, logging thousands of hours in smaller jets before being fast-tracked into the wide-body program due to her exceptional aptitude scores. But as she walked down the aisle toward the flight deck, a quiet, commanding presence in the luxurious cabin, Preston Carmichael's eyes locked onto her. He didn't see an aviation professional. He didn't see top-tier exam scores or thousands of hours of rigorous flight simulator training. What Preston saw was a young black woman wearing the stripes of a commercial airline pilot. Preston lowered his tablet. He leaned forward, his brow furrowing in a deep, cynical scowl. He watched as Valerie offered a polite, brief smile to a passenger in row 1 before stepping into the cockpit and closing the heavy, reinforced door behind her. Preston scoffed loudly. He turned to the man sitting across the aisle in Seat 2D, an older, quiet gentleman named Felix. "Did you see that?" Preston asked, his voice entirely too loud for the subdued cabin. "Tell me I'm hallucinating. Are they letting teenagers fly heavy jets now? Felix offered a non-committal, uncomfortable shrug and quickly returned to his newspaper. But Preston was not a man who let things go. His mind, conditioned by years of cutthroat corporate environments and deep-seated, unchecked prejudices, began to spin a narrative. He felt a sudden, irrational surge of indignation. He was paying $12,000 for this seat. He demanded the best, and in his narrow worldview, the young woman who had just walked past him didn't fit his definition of the best. He pressed the flight attendant call button. He pressed it 3 times in rapid succession. Savannah hurried back into the cabin, a fresh glass of the correct champagne in her hand. "Mr. Carmichael." I verified the bottle. "Forget the champagne," Preston interrupted sharply, waving his hand dismissively. "Who was that?" Savannah blinked, momentarily confused. "Sir," the girl. Preston sneered, placing heavy, venomous emphasis on the word girl. "The one who just paraded down the aisle and went into the cockpit. Don't tell me she's part of the catering crew because she was wearing epaulets." Savannah's professional smile tightened, but she maintained her composure. "That is First Officer Hughes, Mr. Carmichael. She is part of the flight crew for our journey to London tonight." Preston's face hardened. The ambient noise of the cabin seemed to fade away as he locked eyes with the flight attendant. "A first officer. You're telling me a 20-something girl is going to be flying this aircraft across the Atlantic Ocean in this weather? Oh, Mr. Carmichael, First Officer Hughes is highly qualified, and I don't care what she is." Preston cut her off, his voice rising in volume. Passengers in row 3 and 4 were beginning to look up from their seats. The cozy luxury of the cabin was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a tense, prickly atmosphere. "I know exactly what this is. This is corporate box checking. This is trans-global, lowering their standards to meet some ridiculous diversity quota, and I am not going to be a guinea pig for your progressive PR campaign." "Sir, please lower your voice," Savannah said, her tone firmer now. "All of our pilots undergo rigorous world-class training. There is absolutely no compromise on safety. Don't give me the corporate script," Preston snapped, unbuckling his seatbelt and standing up. He towered over Savannah, using his physical presence as an intimidation tactic. "I fly 400,000 miles a year on this airline. I hold Chairman's Circle status. I demand to speak to the captain. Right now, before this plane pushes back from the gate." "Mr. Carmichael, the captain is currently conducting his pre-flight checks. I cannot interrupt. You will interrupt him, or I will open that cockpit door myself." Preston threatened, pointing a finger toward the front of the plane. The threat of a passenger attempting to breach the flight deck, even while parked at the gate, was a severe security violation. Savannah immediately recognized the escalating danger. She stepped back, raised her hand in a calming gesture, and picked up the interphone. A moment later, the heavy cockpit door unlatched. Captain Samuel Bennett stepped out. Samuel was a veteran aviator in his late 50s, with silver hair and the weathered, authoritative face of a man who had flown through every conceivable type of turbulence. He possessed a calm, unshakable demeanor. "Is there a problem out here?" Captain Bennett asked, his deep voice carrying easily through the first-class cabin. "You're damn right there's a problem," Preston barked, stepping into the aisle to confront the captain. "I want to know who is flying this plane." Captain Bennett looked at Preston, sizing him up instantly. He had dealt with entitled passengers before, but there was a dangerous edge to Preston's anger. "I am Captain Bennett. I am the pilot in command, and First Officer Hughes is my co-pilot for this evening. She looks like she barely has her driver's license." Preston shouted, no longer caring who heard him. Several passengers had now pulled out their smartphones, the red recording lights blinking in the dim cabin. "I am paying for excellence. I am paying for safety. I am not paying to sit in the back while you let some affirmative action trainee practice flying a $300 million machine over the ocean." A collective gasp echoed through the cabin. Felix, the man in the seat across from Preston, finally spoke up. "Buddy, you need to sit down and shut up. You're out of line. Mind your own business." Preston snarled at Felix before turning his wrath back to the captain. "I know how this works, Bennett. You guys get pressured by management to push these people through the pipeline, whether they can fly or not. Well, not on my flight. I don't feel safe. As a Chairman's Circle member, I am officially stating that I feel my life is in danger. Remove her from the flight, or I will make sure you're both grounded." Captain Bennett's eyes went cold. The grandfatherly warmth vanished, replaced by the strict, unyielding authority of a ship's commander. "Mr. Carmichael." Captain Bennett said, his voice deadly quiet. "First Officer Hughes is fully certified for this aircraft. She is an exceptional aviator. Furthermore, I do not tolerate discriminatory remarks or abusive behavior toward my crew. You have two choices. You can take your seat and remain silent for the duration of this flight, or I will have airport police escort you back to the terminal." Preston laughed. It was a harsh, humorless sound. "You're going to kick me off me. Do you have any idea who I am?" "I don't care if you're the President of the United States," Captain Bennett replied. "This is my aircraft." "We'll see about that," Preston hissed. The atmosphere inside Flight 882 had become utterly toxic. The boarding process had completely halted, leaving passengers backed up into the jet bridge. The rain outside continued to pound against the fuselage, a chaotic soundtrack to the drama unfolding in the premium cabin. Preston Carmichael reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "You want to play hardball, Bennett?" "Let's play. I have the direct cell phone number of the Vice President of Regional Operations. I play golf with him in Carmel every summer. We're going to see who gets escorted off this plane." Inside the cockpit, Valerie had heard everything. The reinforced door muffled the sound, but Preston's booming, aggressive voice penetrated the barrier. She sat in the right seat, her hands resting tightly on her lap. She felt the burning sting of humiliation, a feeling she had fought against her entire life in a predominantly white male industry. Despite her perfect scores, despite her flawless simulator checks, she knew there would always be men like Preston Carmichael who would look at her skin and her gender and assume she was unqualified. But Valerie possessed a secret that gave her a unique, almost terrifying kind of armor. Her full legal name was Valerie Hughes Montgomery. She used her mother's maiden name, Hughes, professionally, specifically to avoid the shadow of her father. Her father was Charles Montgomery, the ruthless, legendary CEO and majority shareholder of Trans Global Airways. Valerie had spent her life insisting on earning her place. She had forbidden her father from interfering in her career, demanding to go through the exact same grueling process as every other candidate. Preston Carmichael thought he was bullying a powerless junior employee. He was actually bullying airline royalty. Taking a deep breath, Valerie stood up from the first officer's seat. She opened the cockpit door and stepped out to stand beside Captain Bennett. Preston was holding his phone to his ear, listening to it ring when he saw her emerge. His upper lip curled in disgust. "Sir," Valerie said, her voice incredibly steady, lacking even a tremor of the anxiety Preston was trying to inflict upon her. "I understand you have reservations. Aviation is built on safety, and it is natural to want to feel secure. If you would like to review my flight hours or my certification, I would be happy to." "Do not speak to me," Preston snapped, lowering his phone slightly. "You have no business being in this cabin, let alone in that seat. You are a liability. You are a walking PR stunt." "That is enough," Captain Bennett roared, stepping protectively in front of Valerie. "Savannah, call the gate. Get the police down here now." "No, wait," Preston said, holding up a hand, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across his face as someone finally answered his call. "I've got someone on the line you're going to want to hear from." Preston put his phone on speaker and held it up. The voice of Arthur Kensington, The VP of Regional Operations for Transglobal echoed through the quiet, tense cabin. "Preston, it's Friday night. What's going on? Is there a problem with your flight to London?" Arthur's voice was slick, eager to please the high-net-worth client. "Arthur, yes, there is a massive problem," Preston said, locking his eyes onto Valerie with a look of pure venom. "Your captain on Flight 882 is trying to force me to fly with a diversity hire trainee, a young black girl who looks like she belongs in a high school classroom, not the cockpit of a 777. I am officially declaring this a safety hazard." There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the speakerphone. Arthur Kensington knew exactly how much money Preston Carmichael's firm spent with the airline. "Preston, listen, the crew assignments are handled by dispatch, but if you are genuinely feeling unsafe, I am," Preston demanded, "and I am giving you an ultimatum, Arthur. Right here, right now. It's me or her. If she stays on this plane, I walk off. And if I walk off, I am taking my company's $10 million corporate account straight to your biggest competitor by Monday morning. Furthermore, I will personally drag this airline's name through the mud in the Wall Street Journal. Now, tell your captain to remove the trainee." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Even the passengers recording the incident held their breath. Captain Bennett's face was dark with fury, his fists clenched at his sides. He was prepared to throw his own badge on the floor before he let a passenger dictate his crew. But before Captain Bennett could speak, before the spineless VP on the phone could issue a cowardly order, Valerie stepped forward. She gently placed a hand on Captain Bennett's arm, signaling him to wait. The look on her face had completely transformed. The polite, deferential trainee was gone. In her place was a woman who possessed an innate, terrifying authority that mirrored her billionaire father's boardroom demeanor, Mr. Carmichael. Valerie said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a cold, razor-sharp edge that made the hair on the back of Felix's neck stand up. "You are making a very expensive mistake." Preston laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Are you threatening me, little girl? You're done. Go pack your bags." Valerie didn't blink. She calmly reached into her own uniform pocket, pulled out her personal smartphone, and bypassed the standard airline channels entirely. She didn't dial a vice president. She dialed the private unlisted cell phone number of the man who owned the sky they were currently sitting under. "Let's see whose job is really on the line," Valerie said quietly, the phone ringing as she stared directly into Preston Carmichael's eyes. The rhythmic drumming of the heavy Chicago rain against the Boeing 777's fuselage was the only sound in the first-class cabin. Every passenger, from the wealthy tech entrepreneurs in row 3 to the silent observing Felix in 2D, was practically holding their breath. Preston Carmichael stood in the aisle, his chest puffed out in a stance of absolute superiority, the regional vice president still connected on his speakerphone. He wore the triumphant, condescending smirk of a man who believed he had just successfully bullied the universe into bending to his will. He watched with mocking amusement as Valerie pressed the phone to her ear. He fully expected her to be calling a union representative, or perhaps a helpless dispatch manager, who would do nothing but offer apologies and groveling concessions. Instead, the call was answered on the second ring. "Valerie." The voice that came through the earpiece was gravelly rich and instantly recognizable to anyone who spent time in the upper echelons of global commerce. It was a voice that commanded boardrooms, negotiated multi-billion-dollar fleet acquisitions, and terrified Wall Street analysts. Valerie lowered her phone from her ear, her thumb hovering over the screen. She tapped the speaker icon, turning the volume up to maximum. "Hi, Dad," Valerie said, her voice echoing clearly through the hushed cabin. "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, but we have a severe security and operational disruption on Flight 882. The word Dad hung in the air like a suspended anvil. Preston's smirk froze. His brain sharp and accustomed to rapid corporate calculations, hit a sudden, violently abrupt brick wall. Dad. He looked at the young black woman in the pilot's uniform, then down at his own phone, and then back to her. A cold, creeping sensation began to uncoil in the pit of his stomach. "You're past your pushback time." The deep voice on the speaker replied, the tone instantly shifting from paternal warmth to forensic operational sharpness. "Are you dealing with a mechanical issue, or is it the weather cell moving over Lake Michigan?" Neither, Sir. Valerie answered, falling effortlessly into the precise, formal communication style of an aviator, briefing her CEO. "We have a passenger in seat 2, AA Mr. Preston Carmichael, who is refusing to allow the aircraft to depart. He has verbally abused Captain Bennett, aggressively confronted the cabin crew, and explicitly demanded that I be removed from the flight deck." There was a pause on the line. It was not a pause of confusion. It was the terrifying heavy silence of a predator calculating its strike. "On what grounds?" Charles Montgomery asked. "He has stated loudly and repeatedly in front of the entire cabin that I am a diversity hire and a PR stunt, and therefore a threat to his safety." Valerie stated, her eyes locked dead onto Preston's. She didn't blink. She didn't waver. Preston opened his mouth to speak, to yell, to somehow regain control of the narrative, but his vocal cords suddenly felt paralyzed. The regional vice president on Preston's own phone, who had been listening in absolute horrified silence, suddenly let out a choked gasp. Mr. Montgomery." The regional VP stammered through Preston's phone, his voice trembling so violently it sounded like he was standing naked in a blizzard. "Sir, I had absolutely no idea it was I didn't know First Officer Hughes was—" "Who is that on the line?" Charles Montgomery demanded, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register that made several passengers physically shiver. "It's Bradley Fitzgerald, Dad," Valerie replied calmly. Mr. Carmichael called him directly to demand my removal. Bradley was just about to instruct Captain Bennett to have me escorted off the aircraft to appease the client. "I see," Charles said. The calmness in his voice was infinitely more terrifying than if he had been shouting. "Bradley?" "Yes, Mr. Montgomery, sir, I can explain. I was just trying to de-escalate a high net worth—" "Bradley, you are unequivocally immediately terminated," Charles Montgomery said. The words fell like heavy stones into the quiet cabin. "You are stripped of all corporate credentials. Your stock options are frozen pending review. And if you are on company property tomorrow morning, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Hang up the phone." On Preston's device, a frantic clicking sound was followed by the abrupt, hollow beep of a disconnected line. Bradley Fitzgerald had hung up his career vaporized in less than 30 seconds. Preston Carmichael stared at his dead phone, his mouth slightly open, his face draining of all its aggressive, ruddy color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a curb and realized a freight train was inches from his face. "Now," Charles Montgomery continued through Valerie's phone, his voice slicing through the silence. "Put Captain Bennett on." Captain Bennett stepped forward, his posture rigid with respect. "Charles, it's Sam Bennett." "Sam Charles," said his tone softening only marginally. "I apologize that you and my daughter are dealing with this lack of discipline on my aircraft. You are the commander of that vessel. What is your assessment of the passenger in seat 2A? "He is belligerent, insubordinate, and a direct threat to the safety and security of my crew," Sir Captain Bennett replied without a microsecond of hesitation. "Under normal protocols, I would have him removed immediately. Then execute your protocols, Captain, and put the phone close to him. I want to speak to Mr. Carmichael." Valerie took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between herself and Preston. She held the phone out, her expression a mask of pure, untroubled professionalism. Preston stared at the device as if it were an unpinned grenade. He was a senior vice president. He was a master of the universe. But in this exact moment, trapped in a metal tube in Chicago. He was entirely powerless. Mr. Montgomery. Preston started, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its former booming authority. Charles, there has been a massive misunderstanding here. I was merely expressing a concern for standard safety. Do not insult my intelligence. Preston. Charles Montgomery interrupted, his voice echoing like thunder. I know exactly who you are. You are the senior VP of acquisitions at Vanguard Holdings. Your CEO, Edward Gallagher, is a personal friend of mine. In fact, Vanguard Holdings just negotiated a $70 million corporate travel and logistics contract with Trans Global Airways last Thursday. A contract that sits on my desk right now, waiting for my final signature. Preston's knees actually buckled slightly. He reached out to grip the back of seat 1A to steady himself. Charles, please. Let's not let an emotional moment disrupt a mutually beneficial corporate partnership. I was out of line. I'm stressed. The market has been brutal this week. I apologized to the first officer. You don't get to apologize, Charles stated coldly. You don't get to humiliate a brilliant, highly qualified aviator who has logged over 4,000 hours of flight time and passed every FAA check ride with perfect scores just because her race and gender offend your delicate sensibilities. You thought you could use your wealth to bully a junior employee. You thought wrong. Preston was sweating profusely now, the expensive fabric of his suit clinging to his back. I will sit down. I won't say another word. Just let the flight depart. The flight will depart, Charles Montgomery said, but you will not be on it. The absolute finality of the CEO's words hung in the first-class cabin. Preston Carmichael, the man who had halted an international flight with his ego, was now pleading for his corporate survival. Charles, you can't do this, Preston begged, abandoning all pretense of dignity. I have a board meeting in London tomorrow morning. It's a $3 billion merger. If I am not in that room, the deal collapses. My entire career is riding on this flight. Then you should have thought about your career before you decided to play God on my airplane, Charles Montgomery replied, devoid of any sympathy. As of this exact second, Preston, your chairman's circle status is permanently revoked. You are banned from flying Trans Global Airways, our regional partners, and all of our Global Alliance affiliates for life. You are added to our internal no-fly list. Furthermore, I am shredding the Vanguard Holdings contract. I will be calling Edward Gallagher personally in 5 minutes to explain that Vanguard's entire executive team is stripped of their corporate rates and priority statuses until he cleans house. Have a pleasant evening in Chicago. The line went dead. Valerie smoothly slipped her phone back into her uniform pocket. The silence in the cabin was so profound that the hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit sounded like a jet engine. Preston stood entirely frozen, staring at the empty space where the phone had been. In the span of 4 minutes, he had lost his flight, his elite status, his company's multi-million-dollar contract, and almost certainly his job. The sheer catastrophic scale of his downfall was impossible to process. Captain Bennett didn't waste a second. He picked up the interphone. Savannah, open the forward boarding door. The police are already on the jet bridge. Through the small window of the forward door, the flashing blue and red lights of Chicago Police Department cruisers reflected off the wet tarmac. Savannah, whose professional composure had never slipped, unlatched the heavy door and swung it open. A rush of cold, damp air flooded the cabin, followed immediately by 3 heavily armed airport police officers. Officer Peterson, a tall, broad-shouldered man with no tolerance for delays, stepped into the first-class cabin. Captain Bennett, who is the disruptive passenger? Captain Bennett pointed directly at Preston. Seat 2A. He has threatened my crew, attempted to interfere with flight deck operations, and has been officially banned by the airline. I want him removed. Understood, Captain, Officer Peterson said. He turned to Preston, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. Sir, grab your belongings. You're coming with us." But Preston Carmichael's brain had short-circuited. The cocktail of shock humiliation and ruined entitlement mutated into a desperate, panicked rage. He couldn't accept it. He couldn't accept that he, a man who owned penthouses and fired people for sport, was being kicked off a plane. "No," Preston stammered, backing away from the officer, bumping into Felix's legs. "No, I am not leaving. I paid $12,000 for this seat. You can't touch me. I'll sue this airline into bankruptcy. I'll sue you all." Officer Peterson sighed a sound of profound exhaustion. "Sir, you are currently trespassing on a commercial aircraft. I am giving you one lawful order to disembark peacefully. If you refuse, you will be removed by force, and you will be charged with a federal felony for interfering with a flight crew. Do you understand me?" "I am not moving," Preston shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically. He lunged toward his seat, attempting to throw himself into the plush leather chair and buckle the belt, as if the physical act of sitting down would grant him immunity. He never made it. Before Preston could buckle the belt, Officer Peterson and his partner moved with startling speed. Peterson grabbed Preston's left arm, twisting it firmly behind his back in a standard compliance hold, while the second officer secured his right side. "Hey, get your hands off me! Do you know who I am?" Preston screamed, thrashing violently against the officers. His expensive Patek Philippe watch scraped against the plastic molding of the suite. "Yeah, you're the guy going to county jail." Officer Peterson grunted easily, overpowering the executive. With a sharp click, a pair of steel handcuffs snapped tightly around Preston's wrists. The sound was incredibly loud in the enclosed space. The struggle was brief, pathetic, and utterly humiliating. Preston, red-faced, sweating and screaming obscenities, was dragged backward out of his $12,000 suite. As the officers marched him down the aisle toward the open door, Preston locked eyes with Valerie one last time. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She simply stood next to her captain, her posture perfect, her face an unreadable mask of absolute quiet power. She watched him not with anger, but with the cold, clinical pity one reserves for a mosquito that has just been swatted. As the officers hauled Preston Carmichael out the door and into the harsh, freezing reality of the jet bridge, something incredible happened. It started in row 4. A single passenger, a woman in a grey cashmere sweater, began to clap. Then the tech entrepreneur in row 3 joined in. Within seconds, the entire first-class cabin erupted into applause. Passengers were cheering a few, letting out loud whistles. The tension that had choked the cabin for the last 20 minutes shattered, replaced by a wave of collective euphoric relief. Felix, the quiet older man in seat 2D, slowly folded his newspaper. He looked up at Valerie and Captain Bennett, a small, genuine smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well," Felix said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the applause. "I've been flying for 40 years. I think that was the finest pre-flight entertainment I've ever seen." Valerie allowed a tiny professional smile to touch her lips. She nodded gracefully to Felix and the rest of the cabin. "Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen," Captain Bennett announced, raising his voice slightly. "We have a bit of a delay to make up for, but the weather is clearing over the Atlantic, and we anticipate a smooth, quiet ride to London." Savannah stepped forward, holding a silver tray loaded with fresh, perfectly chilled glasses of the 2012 Dom Perignon. "Champagne, everyone?" She offered her smile, now completely genuine and radiant. Captain Bennett turned to Valerie. He placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a firm, proud squeeze. "You handled that flawlessly, First Officer. Your father would be proud. But honestly, I'm prouder. Let's go fly an airplane." "Yes, Captain," Valerie replied. She turned and walked back into the flight deck. She slid into the right seat, ignoring the empty leather chair of 2A visible through the door. She reached up to the overhead panel, flicking the switches to initiate the APU bleed air, her hands moving with the practiced, flawless precision of a master aviator. As Savannah pulled the heavy cockpit door shut, locking out the cabin and sealing them in their sanctuary of glass and glowing instruments, Valerie smiled. The storm outside was breaking, and the sky belonged entirely to her. The harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the Chicago Police Department's 16th District Precinct were a brutal contrast to the soft, mood-enhancing amber glow of the Boeing 777's first-class cabin. There was no champagne here. There were no hot towels, no deferential smiles, and absolutely no respect for corporate titles. The air in the holding area smelled faintly of damp, concrete stale coffee and pine sol. Preston Carmichael sat on a solid steel bench that was bolted entirely to the floor. His bespoke thousands of dollars Navy suit was wrinkled damp from the rain on the tarmac and completely ruined. His expensive silk tie had been confiscated. His shoelaces had been removed, leaving his Italian leather Oxfords flopping uselessly around his feet. The platinum Patek Philippe, watch his ultimate symbol of status, was currently sitting in a cheap plastic evidence bag inside a metal locker. He was trembling, though he would have violently denied that it was from fear. It was shock, a deep, paralyzing, existential shock. Less than 2 hours ago, he was a master of the universe, sipping vintage wine and dictating the rules of reality to those he deemed beneath him. Now he was offender number 8402, facing federal charges for interfering with a flight crew, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. Officer Peterson walked past the holding cell holding a clipboard. Officer Preston called out, his voice hoarse. He tried to summon his boardroom authority, but without his suit jacket, his watch, and his freedom, he just sounded like a desperate, tired man. I need to make my phone call. I have a fundamental constitutional right to a phone call. Officer Peterson stopped looking at Preston through the thick, reinforced glass of the holding door. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly bored. "You'll get your call when booking is finished with the paperwork, buddy. You're not in the fast lane anymore. Sit tight. You don't understand," Preston pleaded, standing up, his shoeless feet shuffling on the cold floor. "I am a senior vice president at Vanguard Holdings. I have a $3 billion corporate merger in London at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. If I am not in that room, the deal falls apart. My entire life is on the line. I need to call my CEO right now." Peterson raised an eyebrow, entirely unmoved. "Should have thought about that before you tried to play air traffic controller, pal. Sit down." It took another agonizing 45 minutes before the heavy steel door unlocked. A desk sergeant escorted Preston to a scarred wooden desk in the corner of the booking room and pointed to a heavy black landline phone. "One call," the sergeant grunted. "Make it count." Preston's fingers shook as he dialed the private cell phone number of Edward Gallagher, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. It was nearly 11 p.m. in Chicago, which meant it was midnight on the East Coast. Preston prayed Edward was awake. He prayed Edward would dispatch the firm's high-powered legal team to bail him out and charter a private Gulfstream jet to get him to London before the morning meeting. The phone rang twice before it was answered. "Preston." Edward Gallagher's voice came through the receiver. It wasn't groggy. It wasn't confused. It was sharp awake and dripping with an icy, terrifying fury. "Edward, thank God," Preston gasped, clutching the phone with both hands. "Listen to me. I am in a desperate situation. I'm at a police precinct in Chicago. There was a massive misunderstanding on the trans-global flight. I was forcefully removed from the aircraft. The police are holding me on ridiculous, completely fabricated federal charges. I need you to wake up the legal department. I need Simon Croft down here immediately to post bail, and I need a private charter prepped at Midway Airport so I can still make the London meeting." There was a silence on the line. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that made the tiny hairs on Preston's arms stand up. "Are you finished?" Edward asked. Edward, you don't understand the CEO of Trans Global. I know exactly who the CEO of Trans Global is. Preston Edward cut him off his voice, rising to a vicious shout that made Preston flinch away from the receiver. I know because Charles Montgomery woke me up 30 minutes ago. He called my private residence. He didn't just cancel our $70 million corporate travel contract. He blacklisted our entire executive team. Do you have any idea how much money you just cost this firm? Because you couldn't keep your mouth shut. Edward, she was a diversity hire. Preston snapped back his ingrained arrogance, momentarily overriding his panic. She was a kid I was looking out for the safety of our firm's top executives. She is the heir to a $10 billion aviation empire, you absolute moron, Edward roared. Charles Montgomery told me everything. He played me the audio from the flight deck, recording Preston. He played the cockpit voice recorder tape of you screaming racial and sexist obscenities at his daughter. Do you know what happens when a tape like that leaks to the Wall Street Journal? Vanguard Holdings will be utterly destroyed in the press. Our stock will plummet by market open. I didn't know. Preston stammered, the remaining blood draining from his face. Edward, I'm sorry. We can fix this. Just get me to London. The $3 billion merger with the Davenport Group will save the quarter. Once I close that deal, this will all be yesterday's news. Edward let out a dry, hollow laugh that held absolutely no humor. It was the sound of a man watching a building burn to the ground. You really don't know, do you? Edward said softly. Know what? Preston asked, a fresh wave of nausea hitting him. You didn't just ruin the Trans Global contract, Preston, Edward explained, his voice turning lethally quiet. 15 minutes after Charles Montgomery called me, I received another phone call. An international call. It was from Felix Davenport. Preston's breath hitched. Felix, the founder of the Davenport Group. Yes. The man we have spent 14 months trying to court. The man whose company you were flying to London to acquire, Edward said. Felix Davenport hates private jets. He always flies commercial first class because he likes to be around the public. He was sitting in seat 2, D. Preston, right across the aisle from you. The cell block seemed to spin around Preston. The old man with the newspaper. The quiet, unassuming gentleman who had told him he was out of line. The man Preston had told to mind his own business. Felix Davenport watched you throw a racist, entitled temper tantrum. Edward continued driving every word like a nail into Preston's coffin. He watched you abuse a young woman, threaten a flight crew, and get dragged off the plane in handcuffs like a common criminal. He called me from the air using the plane's Wi-Fi. He told me that if Vanguard Holdings employs executives with such a catastrophic lack of judgment and fundamental human decency, he would rather burn his company to the ground than merge with us. Preston's knees went weak. He leaned heavily against the wooden desk, the plastic receiver slipping in his sweaty grip. Edward. No, please. The Davenport deal is dead, Preston. The Trans Global contract is dead. And as of this exact second, so is your career, Edward Gallagher stated with absolute finality. You are terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct and violation of our corporate ethics policy. The company will not be providing legal counsel. You will surrender all corporate assets. And if you ever try to contact me, Vanguard Holdings, or anyone associated with this firm again, our lawyers will bury you under a mountain of litigation, so high you won't see daylight for a decade. Have a nice life, Preston. The dial tone buzzed loudly in Preston's ear. He stood there for a long time, listening to the electronic hum, entirely unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his ruin. In the span of an hour, he had lost his freedom, his fortune, his elite status, his reputation, and his entire future. He slowly lowered the phone to the cradle. Time's up, the desk sergeant said, stepping forward with a pair of standard-issue steel handcuffs. "Turn around, offender. Back to the cell." Preston Carmichael didn't argue. He didn't scream. He didn't ask if they knew who he was. For the first time in his privileged, aggressive life, he was utterly, completely silent as the heavy steel door slammed shut, locking him in the cold, windowless reality he had built for himself. While Preston Carmichael sat shivering in a concrete cell in Chicago, thousands of miles away, and 39,000 feet in the air, Flight 882 was carving a smooth, brilliant path through the stratosphere. The heavy rainstorms of the Midwest were long gone, left behind in the dark. As the massive Boeing 777 tracked along the North Atlantic route, the sun began to rise over the curvature of the Earth. It flooded the flight deck with a stunning, piercing golden light, painting the complex arrays of digital displays and illuminated switches in warm hues. Valerie sat in the right seat, her hands resting lightly near the yoke, her eyes scanning the primary flight display with the relaxed, sharp focus of a born aviator. The engines hummed with a deep, powerful resonance that she felt in her bones. This was where she belonged. Not in a boardroom, not behind a mahogany desk like her father, but here suspended between the ocean and the stars. Captain Bennett reached over and adjusted a radio frequency on the center pedestal. He glanced over at Valerie, his weathered face breaking into a warm, paternal smile. "You fly a beautiful heading, First Officer," Captain Bennett said, his voice easily cutting through the ambient noise of the cockpit. "Your fuel management over the oceanic tracks was flawless. We're actually tracking 10 minutes ahead of schedule, despite the delay at O'Hare." "Thank you, Captain," Valerie replied, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "The tailwinds off the coast of Newfoundland gave us a nice push. The aircraft is performing perfectly." "The aircraft is only as good as the hands on the controls," Bennett noted gently. He paused, looking out at the endless expanse of clouds below them. "You know, in my 35 years of flying, I've seen a lot of things. I've seen engines quit, I've seen lightning strike the nose cone, and I've seen passengers lose their minds. But I have never seen anyone handle a hostile situation with the absolute, ice-cold precision you showed back there." Valerie kept her eyes on the horizon. "I've had to develop a thick skin, Captain. When you look like me and you're in this seat, there will always be a Preston Carmichael waiting in the wings to tell you that you don't belong. If I lost my temper every time a man underestimated me, I'd never get off the ground." "Well, you didn't just get off the ground," Bennett laughed softly. "You put him exactly where he belonged. And you didn't need your father's name to do it. You did it with your own authority." "My father just provided the microphone," Valerie smiled. "The authority was all mine." "Prepare for descent," Captain Bennett instructed, shifting back into his formal commander role. "London Control is handing us off to Heathrow approach. The weather in London is typical overcast light drizzle, but visibility is good. You're flying the approach, Valerie. Take us home, my aircraft." Valerie confirmed, her hands moving over the autopilot controls to initiate the step-down descent. 40 minutes later, the massive Boeing 777 broke through the thick grey cloud cover over London. The sprawling historic city spread out below them, a patchwork of wet streets and ancient architecture. Valerie's hands were steady on the yoke as she disconnected the autopilot. She flew the 300-ton machine, manually feeling the heavy responsive controls. "Flaps 20, Valerie commanded. "Flaps 20 speed checked." Bennett confirmed, moving the lever. "Gear down. Gear down 3 green." The runway threshold at Heathrow appeared through the rain-streaked windshield. Valerie made tiny, microscopic adjustments to the pitch and roll, fighting a slight crosswind with effortless rudder inputs. She brought the massive jet down smoothly the rear wheels, kissing the tarmac with a gentle, satisfying chirp. She smoothly engaged the thrust reversers, the powerful roar of the engines, slowing the aircraft safely on the wet runway. "Beautiful landing," Bennett praised. Welcome to London, First Officer. As the aircraft taxied to the gate and the engine spooled down to silence, the heavy cockpit door unlocked. Savannah, the lead flight attendant, popped her head in, beaming. Captain First Officer, the passengers are disembarking. But there's a gentleman who insists on speaking to you before he leaves, Savannah said. Valerie unbuckled her 5-point harness and stepped out of the flight deck. Standing in the galley area waiting patiently was Felix, the quiet older man from Seat 2D. He looked rested, his trench coat folded over his arm. First Officer Hughes, Felix said, extending his hand. So thank you for stepping in back in Chicago, Valerie said, shaking his hand warmly. It was a difficult situation, and your support was appreciated. Felix chuckled, shaking his head. My dear, you didn't need my support. I have negotiated treaties with foreign governments that were less impressive than the way you dismantled that bully. I wanted to formally introduce myself. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed Valerie a heavy matte black business card with embossed gold lettering. Valerie looked down at it. Felix Davenport, founder and chairman, the Davenport Group. Mr. Davenport, Valerie said, her eyes widening slightly in recognition. Every major business news outlet had been covering the potential Vanguard-Davenport merger for months. I was flying to London to sign a merger with Vanguard Holdings. Felix explained, a stern look crossing his face. Preston Carmichael was supposed to be the man bringing me the final paperwork. Seeing his true character, seeing the arrogance and prejudice that Vanguard apparently rewards, told me everything I needed to know about that company. I killed the deal from the air. Valerie was stunned, realizing the sheer catastrophic scale of Preston's self-destruction. But more importantly, Felix continued, his smile returning. I wanted to tell you that Trans Global has just gained a lifelong client. When I fly, I want to know my safety is in the hands of professionals who possess grace under fire. You are an exceptional pilot, Miss Hughes. If your father ever decides to step down, I hope he leaves the airline to you. Thank you, Mr. Davenport, Valerie said, deeply moved. That means the world to me. Have a wonderful stay in London, Felix nodded, turning to exit the aircraft. 2 weeks later, the fallout from Flight 882 was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Despite Vanguard Holdings' desperate attempts to suppress the story, an anonymous passenger in the first-class cabin had uploaded a video of Preston Carmichael's arrest to the internet. It went violently viral. The internet dubbed him the Platinum Passenger, a symbol of unchecked corporate entitlement. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page exposé on the collapse of the Vanguard-Davenport merger, specifically citing Preston's racist meltdown as the catalyst. Vanguard Holdings' stock plummeted by 14% in a single week. To appease their shareholders and save their remaining reputation, Edward Gallagher was forced to step down as CEO, replaced by a diverse progressive board of directors determined to overhaul the company's toxic culture. Preston Carmichael was entirely blacklisted from the corporate world. Facing massive legal fees for the federal charges brought against him by the FAA and the Chicago Police Department, he was forced to sell his penthouse at a severe loss. His days of flying in luxury, demanding vintage champagne, and bullying airline staff were permanently over. He was a ruined man, left only with the bitter, inescapable knowledge that he had destroyed his own life. Meanwhile, at the gleaming corporate headquarters of Trans Global Airways in downtown Chicago, a very different scene was unfolding. The massive boardroom on the 50th floor was filled with executive staff, senior pilots, and aviation instructors. At the front of the room stood Charles Montgomery, his imposing figure radiating immense pride. Standing next to him, looking immaculate in her crisp, newly minted uniform, was Valerie Hughes. Aviation is an industry built on precision discipline and absolute integrity. Charles Montgomery's booming voice echoed across the room. We do not compromise on safety, and we do not compromise on the respect we demand for our crew. Today, We are not here to celebrate a name or a legacy. We are here to celebrate an aviator who has proven under extreme duress that she possesses the exact character required to command the skies. Charles turned to his daughter. He picked up a small velvet box from the podium and opened it. Inside rested a pair of silver captain's wings. While Valerie was officially still a first officer, she had successfully completed all requirements and line checks to enter the fast-track captaincy program. "Valerie," Charles said softly, the CEO persona, melting away, leaving only a profoundly proud father. "You earned this. Every single mile, every single hour. I have never been more honored to fly with anyone." He pinned the wings to her lapel. The entire boardroom erupted into a standing ovation. Valerie stood tall, looking out over the crowd of her peers. She thought of the heavy rain in Chicago, the hostility of a man who thought she was nothing, and the endless, beautiful sunrise over the Atlantic Ocean. She had weathered the storm. She wasn't just a trainee. She wasn't a diversity hire. She was a master of the sky, and her journey was just beginning. If you loved this story of entitled arrogance, meeting its ultimate downfall, hit that like button and share with your friends. We bring you the most thrilling, dramatic, and satisfying real-life stories where justice is truly served. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest uploads. Have you ever witnessed a massive public meltdown, like Preston's drop, a comment right below, and tell us your craziest airport or travel stories? Your support helps us create more amazing content. Stay tuned, stay grounded, and we will see you next time.